The great council chamber of the Galactic Concord floated in the darkness of space. A massive station built from metals and crystals harvested from 1,000 different worlds. Inside its curved walls, representatives from 417 different species gathered to discuss matters of trade, territory, and sometimes war. Their seats formed a perfect spiral that climbed upward, toward a dome ceiling made of transparent material that showed the stars. Beyond, Ambassador Corveth of the Ilthrani hegemony was new to this place. His species were tall beings covered in dark scales, with forearms and eyes that glowed like burning coals. They were predators by nature. Hunters who had clawed their way to dominance on a planet where everything wanted to kill everything else. Corveth was proud of his people and their strength. He believed that power was the only language the universe truly understood. On his first day in the council chamber, he noticed something strange. There were 418 seats, but only 417 species in the Concord. One seat, positioned at a place of honor near the center of the spiral, remained empty. It was simple in design, made from some kind of dark wood that Corveth did not recognize. With a small blue and green symbol carved into its back, he asked his assistant about it. But the young Ilthrani only shook his head and suggested that Corveth ask one of the senior ambassadors. So he did. The Morvathi counselor was one of the oldest beings in the chamber. Her body was made of living crystal that had grown and shifted over thousands of years, and her voice sounded like wind moving through caves. When Corveth asked about the empty seat, she went very still. The other ambassadors nearby also stopped their conversations and turned to listen. That seat belongs to the humans, the Morvathi said at last. They earned it 60 years ago, and they have never once used it. Corveth let out a barking laugh, the Ilthrani way of showing disbelief. The humans. I have studied their file. They are a young species from an unremarkable planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. They control fewer than 50 star systems. Their fleet is small. Why would such a minor power deserve a permanent seat of honor? The silence that followed his words was heavy and uncomfortable. Even the Drethiki swarm mind. A collective intelligence made up of millions of tiny insects that usually buzzed constantly with internal chatter, had gone completely quiet. You are new here, the Morvathi counselor said, and there was something in her voice that might have been pity. In time, you will learn. You will learn why that chair remains empty until the humans choose to fill it. You will learn why, whenever any discussion of war begins in this chamber, we send a message to Earth first and wait for their response before proceeding. We have learned, Ambassador Corveth, that waiting for the humans is always the wiser choice. Corveth wanted to argue, but something in the way every single ambassador was looking at him made him hold his tongue. He returned to his seat and spent the rest of the session watching that empty chair, wondering what could possibly make so many powerful species afraid of such a small civilization far across the galaxy. On a planet called Earth, a man named Daniel Cole sat in an office buried deep beneath a mountain range. The office was not impressive. It had plain walls, simple furniture, and a window that showed a fake sky because there was no real sunlight this far underground. Daniel himself was equally unimpressive in appearance. He was of average height with brown hair that was starting to turn gray. His face was the kind that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. He wore simple clothes and drank his coffee from a chipped mug that said "World's Okay" as Dad on the side. His job title was Deputy Director of Extraterrestrial Relations. Most humans had no idea his department even existed. Those who did generally assumed it was a minor office that handled boring paperwork about trade agreements with alien species. They were wrong about that, but Daniel preferred it that way. His work was easier when people underestimated him. A message had arrived that morning from the Galactic Concord, delivered by one of the faster-than-light courier drones that the aliens used for important communications. Daniel read it twice, then set it down on his desk and rubbed his eyes. The Ilthrani hegemony was demanding that the Concord support military action against another species called the Keth Dominion. The dispute was about mining rights in a cluster of asteroids called the Vandross Cluster. Both species claimed the asteroids belonged to them. Both species were refusing to negotiate. Both species were building up their fleets and preparing for war. It was, Daniel thought, incredibly stupid. The asteroids in question contained valuable minerals, yes, but not so valuable that they were worth dying over. A reasonable compromise could give both sides most of what they wanted. But young species rarely thought in terms of compromise. They thought in terms of winning and losing, of dominance and submission. Daniel picked up his phone and called his assistant in the next room. Linda, I need two things. First, get me a secure line to Admiral Reyes at Fleet Command. Second, pull all our files on the Vandross cluster. I want the complete analysis, not the summary. The thick files? Linda asked. The thick files. He hung up and walked to his fake window, looking at the fake sunshine projected on the fake sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the miles of rock above his head, beyond the atmosphere, beyond the boundaries of the solar system, powerful aliens were preparing to kill each other over rocks floating in empty space. And once again, it would fall to humanity to stop them. He hoped the Ilthrani would be reasonable. He hoped a few carefully worded messages and some diplomatic pressure would be enough to prevent this war before it started. He hoped he would not have to authorize a demonstration. The demonstrations always worked. That was the problem. They worked too well and they left scars on everyone involved. The humans who carried them out, the aliens who witnessed them, the families of those who did not survive. Daniel had authorized 2 demonstrations in his career. He still woke up some nights with their faces floating in his memory, but he would do it again if he had to. That was his job. That was humanity's job. Not to conquer the galaxy, not to rule over other species, but to stand in the shadows and make sure that the wars that could be prevented were prevented. To be the threat that no one wanted to face. To keep their seat at every war table empty, because the moment they had to fill it, the moment they had to step out of the shadows and act, people would die. Better for everyone if it never came to that. Better for everyone if the Ilthrani and the Keth looked at the bigger, pictured, and found a peaceful solution. Daniel finished his coffee and got to work. The older ambassadors in the Galactic Concord did not talk about what had happened 47 years ago. They changed the subject when younger members asked questions. They left the room when historians came to interview them. They had nightmares about it, some of them, even after all this time. But the records existed for anyone willing to look, and Ambassador Korvath was very willing to look. He spent 3 days in the Concord archives, reading everything he could find about humanity and their rise to their current position. What he found confused him at first, then disturbed him, and finally terrified him in ways he had never experienced before. It had started with a species called the Vreth Collective. The Vreth had been expanding through the galaxy for over 2,000 years by the time they turned their attention toward human space. They were conquerors of the worst kind, creatures that absorbed other species into their own biology, breaking down their bodies and minds and rebuilding them as extensions of the Vreth whole. They called this process joining the greater unity and claimed it was a gift they offered to lesser beings. The species they consumed called it something else. They called it death. The Galactic Concord had done nothing to stop the Vreth. They issued statements of concern. They passed resolutions expressing disappointment. They imposed economic sanctions that the Vreth ignored completely. For 2,000 years, the Vreth had eaten their way across the stars, and no one had been willing to stand against them. Then the Vreth had looked at humanity and seen easy prey. The humans controlled only a handful of star systems at that time. Their technology was crude by galactic standards. Their ships were small and few in number. Their population was tiny compared to the great powers of the Concord. When the Vreth announced their intention to bring humanity into the greater unity, most observers assumed the humans would simply surrender and hope for the best. They did not surrender. Admiral Patricia Dunn had been in command of Earth's defense forces when the Vreth invasion fleet arrived. She was a small woman, old by human standards, with gray hair and eyes that had seen terrible things long before she ever looked at the stars. She had grown up during a time when humans still fought wars against each other, and she carried the lessons of those wars with her. The Vreth sent 12 battle groups toward the human colony of New Providence. Nearly 800 warships, more firepower than humanity possessed in their entire fleet, arranged in perfect formation to demonstrate overwhelming superiority. The Vreth commander broadcast a message offering the Huma NS one chance to surrender peacefully and join the Unity without resistance. Patricia Dunn sent 17 ships to meet them, 17 small frigates, each carrying a crew of 40 men and women. Their weapons were classified as minimal threat by Vreth intelligence. Their armor was thin. Their engines were slow by comparison to Vreth vessels. On paper, it should not have been a battle at all. It should have been an execution. For 3 days, nothing happened. The human ships scattered into the void and vanished. The Vreth fleet advanced toward New Providence without resistance. Their commanders joking about human cowardice, their crews already celebrating their easy victory. Then a Vreth dreadnought, one of the largest and most powerful warships in their fleet, simply stopped existing. There was no explosion. There was no weapon signature. There was no warning of any kind. One moment the ship was there, carrying 5,000 Vreth warriors, and the next moment it was an expanding cloud of dust and gas. The ships nearest to it detected nothing. Their sensors showed empty space where their comrade had been, before the Vreth could even begin to understand what had happened. 2 more ships vanished in exactly the same way. Then 5 more. Then 20. Panic swept through the Vreth fleet like fire through dry grass. They fired their weapons in every direction, filling space with enough destructive energy to crack moons, but they hit nothing. They activated every sensor and scanner they possessed, searching desperately for the enemy that was killing them, and they found only emptiness. Their ships died one by one, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, and the survivors could do nothing but watch and scream. Admiral Patricia Dunn's 17 frigates destroyed 412 Vreth warships in 6 hours. The remaining vessels fled into hyperspace, their crews broken by terror, their commanders unable to explain what had happened. Not one human ship was scratched. Not one human life was lost. The Vreth Collective refused to accept this defeat. They gathered a fleet 5 times larger than the first and sent it toward human space, determined to avenge their losses and prove that the first battle had been some kind of trick or accident. This time, the humans did not send ships. They sent a message. Corveth found that message in the archives, but it was sealed with the highest classification level the Concorde possessed. He could not access its contents. He could only read about what happened after the Vreth leadership received it within 24 hours. The Vreth Collective announced complete and unconditional surrender. They withdrew from every territory they had taken in the past 1,000 years. They paid reparations to every species they had wronged. They dissolved their military entirely, dismantling their warships and destroying their weapons. Their leaders went into voluntary exile on isolated worlds. The Vreth Collective, the terror of the galaxy for 2,000 years, transformed overnight to a peaceful federation that built schools and hospitals instead of warships. No one outside the Vreth leadership ever learned what was in that message. When asked, the surviving Vreth would only shake their heads and refuse to speak. Some of them wept. Some of them simply stared into the distance with empty eyes. Admiral Patricia Dunn addressed the Galactic Concorde 3 days later. Corveth found the recording of her speech and watched it 7 times, studying every word, every gesture, every expression on her aged face. "We do not wish to fight," she had said, her voice calm and quiet. "We will never start a war. But if war comes to us, we will finish it in ways that make fighting us unthinkable. We have shown you a small sample of what we can do when threatened. We sincerely hope we never have to show you more. We would very much prefer to be your friends. Please do not force us to be anything else." The Concorde had voted unanimously to grant humanity a permanent seat that same day. Corveth understood now why that seat remained empty. The humans did not need to sit in it. Their presence was felt every time someone looked at that simple wooden chair and remembered what its owners were capable of doing. He closed the archive files and sat alone in the darkness for a long time, thinking about his request for Concorde support, against the Keth, thinking about what might happen if he pushed too hard, and drew humanity's attention, thinking about a message. He never wanted to receive the dispute over the Vandross cluster. Had been building for almost a decade. It was the kind of conflict that looked simple from the outside but grew more complicated the closer you examined it. Two species wanted the same rocks floating in empty space, and neither one was willing to share. The Ilthrani hegemony had discovered the cluster first, or at least they claimed they had. Their survey ships had mapped the asteroid fields and identified the rich veins of rare minerals hidden within them. They had filed the proper paperwork with the Galactic Concord, establishing their claim under the laws that governed such discoveries. But the Keth Dominion produced older records showing that their ancestors had visited the same region centuries before the Ilthrani even achieved spaceflight. They argued that ancient presence established prior claim. Regardless of who filed paperwork with the Concord, both arguments had merit. Both species had invested pride and resources into the dispute. And now, after years of failed negotiations and rising tensions, both species were preparing for war. Daniel Cole understood all of this. He had spent 2 days reading the thick files Linda had assembled, learning everything there was to know about the Vandross situation. He understood the politics, the economics, the cultural factors driving both sides toward conflict. What he did not understand was why anyone thought war was a reasonable solution. The minerals in the Vandross cluster were valuable. Certainly, they could be used to build better starship engines, more efficient power systems, advanced medical equipment, but the cost of a war would far exceed the value of those minerals. Ships would be destroyed. Lives would be lost. Economies would collapse. Both species would spend generations recovering from the damage. It made no sense. And yet species kept making this choice again and again throughout history. Daniel had seen it dozens of times in his career. Intelligent beings who could calculate complex equations and build machines that bent the laws of physics would somehow convince themselves that killing each other was the best solution to a problem that negotiation could solve in an afternoon. He made 2 calls that morning. First was to Admiral Reyes at Fleet Command. She was a serious woman with short dark hair and the bearing of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for battles she hoped would never come. Daniel explained the situation and asked for a status report on their assets near the Vandross region. "We have monitoring stations throughout that sector," Admiral Reyes reported. "Nothing visible, nothing that would register on anyone's sensors, but we can see everything that happens. If either side starts moving their fleet, we will know within minutes." "Good. Keep watching. I am hoping this will resolve itself through diplomatic channels, but I want options if it does not." "How much latitude do I have if things escalate?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. "Prepare for a demonstration, but do not execute without my direct authorization. I want to avoid that if possible." "You always want to avoid that," Admiral Reyes said, and there was no judgment in her voice. "That is why you are good at your job." The second call was more difficult. Daniel contacted his counterpart among the Keth Dominion, being named Sethrix, who served as their senior diplomat for human relations. Sethrix had spent 20 years living on Earth as an exchange student and cultural ambassador, and he understood humanity better than almost any alien alive. "I assume you are calling about Vandross," Sethrix said, when the connection established. His species communicated through a combination of sounds and color changes in their skin, but the translator rendered his words into clear English, with only a slight electronic accent. "The Ilthrani are pushing hard for war," Daniel said. "They have formally requested Concord support for military action against your people." "I am aware. Our own government is under pressure from military leaders who see this as an opportunity to test our new fleet capabilities. They believe we could defeat the Ilthrani in direct combat. They might be right. That is not the point." "No," Sethrix agreed. "The point is that war would be stupid and wasteful regardless of who wins." "Exactly. I need you to help me prevent it. Can you convince your government to offer some concessions on the mining rights? Not everything the Ilthrani want, but enough to give them a face-saving victory." There was a long pause. When Sethrix spoke again, His voice was heavy with frustration. That will be difficult. Our leaders have made public statements committing to full ownership of the cluster. Backing down now would make them look weak. Looking weak is better than being dead. Remind them of that. Remind them of what happened to the Vreth. Remind them that humanity has been quiet for 47 years and would very much like to remain quiet. Is that a threat? No, it is a statement of fact. We do not make threats, Sethrix. You know that. We simply act when action becomes necessary. I am trying very hard to make sure action does not become necessary in this case. Help me. Another pause. Then Sethrix let out a sound that the translator rendered as a tired sigh. I will make calls. I will push as hard as I can. But you will need to apply equal pressure on the Ilthrani side. Their ambassador Corveth is young and aggressive. He sees war as a path to glory. Leave Corveth to me. Daniel ended the call and sat back in his chair, thinking about his next move. The Ilthrani were predators by nature, evolved on a world where strength determined survival. They did not respond well to words and arguments. They respected only power. Fortunately, humanity had plenty of power. The challenge was using it wisely, applying exactly enough pressure to change behavior, without causing the kind of fear that might trigger a desperate response. It was like handling a wild animal. Too gentle and it would ignore you. Too forceful and it might attack. Daniel pulled up his files on Ambassador Corveth and began planning a lesson in humility. He would give the Ilthrani exactly what they needed to see. Nothing more and nothing less. He would show them what humanity was capable of. Remind them why their elders spoke of Earth in whispered voices. And then he would offer them a way out that let them keep their pride. While avoiding the war that would destroy them, it was delicate work. Dangerous work. The kind of work that could go wrong in 100 different ways. But someone had to do it. Someone had to stand between the galaxy's young and foolish species and the wars they seemed determined to start. Someone had to fill that empty seat at the war table. Even if they never actually sat in it, Daniel began composing a message to the Ilthrani diplomatic vessel. It was time to invite Ambassador Corveth to Earth for a conversation. Ambassador Corveth received the invitation from Earth and immediately decided to turn it into a show of strength. He was tired of waiting for the humans to respond to his war proposal. He was tired of the way older species treated Earth with such nervous respect. He intended to demonstrate that the Ilthrani hegemony would not be intimidated by a minor power hiding in a distant corner of the galaxy. Instead of traveling alone in a diplomatic shuttle, as the invitation suggested, he assembled a fleet of 40 heavy cruisers, the finest warships his species had ever built. Each vessel bristled with weapons capable of cracking planetary surfaces. Each carried crews of hardened warriors eager to prove themselves in battle. It was not technically an act of war to enter another species' territory with a military fleet. It was merely a serious diplomatic insult that showed contempt for the host. Corveth expected the humans to protest. He expected them to file complaints with the Galactic Concord. He expected them to demonstrate their weakness through words and legal actions, rather than meaningful response. That expectation would prove to be the greatest mistake of his career. The Ilthrani fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system and immediately began scanning for threats. Their sensors were among the best in the galaxy, capable of detecting ships at enormous distances, penetrating most forms of stealth technology, analyzing power signatures and weapons, systems with extraordinary precision. The sensors showed almost nothing. A handful of small patrol vessels moved through the inner system. A few defensive platforms orbited the third planet, the one the humans called Earth. Some civilian traffic moved between the planets and moons. By any reasonable military assessment, the system was poorly defended. It's almost completely vulnerable to attack. Corveth smiled and ordered his fleet to advance. He composed a message to send back to his government describing how the famous humans had proven to be nothing. It's more than a paper threat. A species that had gotten lucky once against the Vreth and had been coasting on that reputation ever since. He never sent that message. 3 hours into their approach, the tactical officer on Corvat's flagship made a sound that the Ilthrani only produced when facing certain death. It was an ancient noise hardwired into their biology from millions of years of evolution. A warning that every cell in the officer's body was screaming at him to run. Corveth spun toward the main display screen, and his heart stopped. Ships were appearing out of nothing. Human ships. Thousands of them. Emerging from what had seemed like empty space as their stealth fields dropped in perfect coordination. They surrounded the Ilthrani fleet in every direction, above and below, ahead and behind. A sphere of silent metal that had been completely invisible until the moment the humans chose to reveal themselves. Each ship was small by Ilthrani standards, but their power signatures made no sense. They radiated energy levels that should have required reactors many times their apparent size. Their hulls were covered in systems and structures that Ilthrani engineers could not identify or explain. They moved with perfect precision, thousands of vessels acting as one, maintaining formation without any visible communication between them, and then every screen on every Ilthrani ship displayed the same message, appearing simultaneously, bypassing their communication security, as if it simply did not exist. You have entered human space without invitation. We will assume this is a navigational error unless you indicate otherwise. Please state your intentions. Corvath's claws trembled as he read those words. The humans had hidden an entire fleet in their home system, undetectable by the most advanced sensors the galaxy could produce. They had penetrated Ilthrani computer systems without triggering any alarms or defenses. They had done this calmly, without threats, without aggression. With the quiet confidence of a predator so far above its prey that displays of dominance were unnecessary, all his plans for intimidation collapsed in that moment. All his assumptions about human weakness shattered against the reality now surrounding his fleet. He understood finally what the older ambassadors had tried to tell him. The humans were not weak. They had simply chosen to be quiet. The difference between those two things was the difference between life and death. He typed his response with shaking claws. All his earlier bravado, completely gone. We are here to discuss the Vandross situation. We request a diplomatic meeting. The reply came instantly. Request granted. Please follow the guide vessel to Earth. Your fleet will remain at the edge of the system. They will be safe. You have our word. It was not phrased as a request. It was not phrased as a command either. It was simply a statement of how things would be, delivered with absolute certainty that compliance would follow. Corveth ordered his fleet to comply. A tiny human vessel, barely larger than a shuttle, separated from the surrounding swarm and began moving toward the inner system. Corvath's flagship followed, leaving his proud fleet of heavy cruisers behind like children left at the door while adults conducted serious business. The journey to Earth took several hours at the speed the guide vessel set. Corveth spent that time watching the human ships through his viewports, studying them, trying to understand what he was seeing. The vessels moved in patterns that seemed almost organic, flowing around each other like fish in a school, never colliding, never losing formation, responding to changes in the environment. Before those changes became visible, he remembered the records he had read about the Vreth invasion. 17 human frigates had destroyed over 400 warships without ever being detected. At the time, he had assumed the Vreth were simply incompetent, that any competent military force could have done better. Now, surrounded by thousands of human ships that his own advanced sensors had failed completely to detect, he understood how wrong that assumption had been. The Vreth had not been incompetent. They had simply been facing something so far beyond their capabilities that competence was irrelevant. His flagship entered orbit around Earth, and Corveth looked down at the planet below. It was beautiful, he had to admit. Blue oceans and green land masses under swirling white clouds. A small world by galactic standards, unremarkable in most respects. And yet this tiny planet had produced a species that could hide fleets in plain sight. That could send messages capable of making ancient conquerors surrender overnight. That could sit quietly in the shadows of the galaxy for decades and still be feared by everyone who knew their name. A shuttle arrived to transport him to the surface. As Corveth boarded it, he realized that he was no longer thinking about war with the Keth Dominion. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about how to get himself, and his fleet out of this system alive. He was thinking about that empty chair in the Concord chamber, and he was beginning to understand why it inspired such terror in those who knew its true meaning. The meeting took place in a small conference room in a city called Geneva. In a building that looked ordinary from the outside, there were no guards visible, no security checkpoints, no displays of military power. Just a simple room with a wooden table, some comfortable chairs, and a window that showed snow-covered mountains in the distance. Daniel Cole was already seated when Ambassador Corveth entered. The human rose and offered a gesture of greeting that Corveth recognized from his cultural briefings and indicated a chair across the table. Everything about him was unremarkable. Average height, average build, brown hair going gray, a face that would disappear in any crowd. He wore simple civilian clothing and drank from a cup that appeared to contain some kind of hot beverage. This was the man who commanded the silent terror of the galaxy. This was the man who had authorized the display that had shattered Corvat's confidence in everything he thought he knew about power. "Please, sit," Daniel said. His voice was calm and friendly, as if they were old acquaintances meeting for a casual conversation. "I hope your journey was comfortable," Corveth sat. His scales felt tight against his body, a stress response that his species had evolved millions of years ago. "It was educational," he managed to say. Daniel nodded as if this answer made perfect sense. "I apologize for the rather dramatic welcome. We do not normally reveal our defensive capabilities to visitors, but I felt that some context might be helpful for our discussion today." Context. The human was calling the most terrifying military display Corveth had ever witnessed mere context, as if showing that they could have destroyed his entire fleet without effort was simply background information for a business meeting. "The Vandross situation," Daniel continued, sliding a small device across the table. "I have been working with my counterpart among the Keth to find a solution. This document contains the details of a proposed agreement." Corveth picked up the device and read the contents. It was a compromise, giving the Ilthrani 40% of the mining rights in the Vandross cluster, while the Keth retained the remainder. Joint administration of shared territories. Mutual security guarantees. Economic cooperation agreements that would benefit both species. "This is more than we would have demanded through negotiation," Corveth said slowly, "but less than we could have taken through conquest." "Conquest would have been expensive," Daniel replied. "Ships destroyed, lives lost, resources wasted on destruction instead of development. And that assumes you would have won the war cleanly. The Keth have their own military capabilities. A war between your peoples could have lasted for decades. We are warriors. We do not fear long wars, perhaps not. But consider what you would be fighting for. Rocks floating in space. Minerals that could be obtained through trade as easily as through combat. The Vandross cluster is valuable, certainly, but not so valuable that it justifies the deaths of millions of your people." Corveth felt anger rising in his chest, the predator instinct that had driven his species to dominance on their homeworld. "You speak of avoiding death, yet your own history is written in blood. I have read about your wars, human. You nearly destroyed yourselves a dozen times before you reached the stars." Daniel did not flinch from this accusation. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "You are correct. We did nearly destroy ourselves. Nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, conflicts over resources and ideology. We came within moments of extinction more than once." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. "That is why we are the way we are now. Those experiences taught us what most young species have not yet learned. They taught us that the greatest strength is not what you can destroy, but what you choose not to destroy. They taught us that true power lies in restraint, not in aggression." Corveth considered this. "And yet you maintain fleets that could destroy any force in the galaxy. You develop weapons that make the greatest powers look like children with toys. How is that restraint? We maintain those capabilities so that we never have to use them. We develop those weapons so that no one is tempted to test us. Our strength exists to prevent war, not to wage it." Daniel turned back to face Corveth. "Think about what you saw today. Thousands of ships, hidden in our home system, ready to defend our world against any threat. We have had those ships for 47 years. In all that time, we have never used them offensively. Not once. Not against the Vreth remnants. Not against the pirates who occasionally threaten our outer colonies. Not against anyone, then why show them to me? Because you needed to understand. The Galactic Concord gave us a permanent seat at every war table because they know we will use our power wisely. We do not attend their meetings. We do not vote on their resolutions. We simply exist, a reminder that there are consequences to aggression, that someone is always watching, always ready to act, if necessary. That quiet presence prevents more wars than any fleet could win. Corveth sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had heard and seen. The predator instincts that had served his ancestors so well on their deadly homeworld were screaming at him to fight, to challenge, to prove his dominance. But a deeper part of his mind, the part that had learned to plan and calculate and think beyond immediate impulses, understood what the human was telling him. The Ilthrani had risen to power through strength and aggression. They had conquered their world and reached for the stars because they were the most dangerous things on their planet. But the galaxy was larger than their planet, and there were things in it more dangerous than they could comprehend. Humanity was one of those things. Not because humans were violent or cruel, but because they had learned to be patient, to be silent, to wait in the shadows until action was truly necessary. They had turned their capacity for destruction into a shield rather than a sword, and in doing so, they had become something that even the greatest predators could not challenge. "I will sign the agreement," Corveth said finally. "I will recommend that my government accept these terms." Daniel smiled, the first genuine warmth Corveth had seen from him. "Thank you, Ambassador. I believe this is the beginning of a productive relationship between our peoples." "May I ask one more question?" "Of course." "That empty seat in the Concord chamber, the one that has never been used, will humanity ever fill it?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps someday, when the galaxy no longer needs us to remain in the shadows. When species learn to resolve their differences without reaching for weapons, when that seat becomes simply a chair rather than a symbol. On that day, we might sit down and join the conversation openly." He extended his hand, a human gesture of agreement that Corveth had learned to recognize. "Until then, we will remain what we have always been. The silent watchers. The reserved seat at every war table. The reminder that peace is always possible for those wise enough to choose it." Corveth took the offered hand, feeling the strange softness of human skin against his scales. In that moment, he made a decision that would shape Ilthrani policy for generations to come. He would return to his people and tell them what he had learned. He would warn them never to threaten humanity, never to test their patience, never to give them reason to fill that empty chair. And in his private reports, read only by the highest leaders of the hegemony, he would include a single recommendation that would become sacred law among his kind. Let the humans remain silent. Let their seat remain empty. Their quiet is the greatest gift the galaxy has ever received. And we must do everything in our power to ensure it lasts forever. For all their sakes,